Silenthill is my most anticipated Silent Hill game in years, but is it actually a Soulslike? Let's break it down. Silenthill is easily the game I'm most excited to play this year. At first I wrote it off since I only knew the developers from the Devil May Cry remasters and the online game Resident Evil Resistance, which most people disliked. That all changed, of course, when they actually started showing footage of the game. At first it seemed familiar to Silent Hill 2 Remake, a game I absolutely loved, but with a traditional Japanese aesthetic. Silent Hill went through a westernization during the Xbox 360 era, which killed interest in the franchise, so this change feels very welcome, especially now that we don't have J-horror games as we used to, like Fatal Frame and Siren. Silenthill seems like the perfect replacement for those games. Until now, we only knew fragments of the story and gameplay, but recently, media outlets got to play 5 hours of the game. Previews have been largely positive, which makes me very excited. There also have been a few caveats though, namely regarding the combat. So is Silenthill a Souls-like? Well, not exactly, but kind of, I guess. From the previews, we know that the game starts with schoolgirl Inako, the main protagonist, running from her house after being scolded by her drunk father. The first section of the game appears to be very similar to the beginning of Silent Hill 2. In that game, James walks a long and eerie road before getting to Silent Hill, and in here, Inako walks through the long and narrow maze-like streets of Ebisugoka, which means Silent Hill in Japanese. So technically, the game takes place in Silent Hill, or at least in a Silent Hill. Once you find your friends, the village gets covered by familiar fog, but also something new, mysterious crimson flowers. We run as Inako trying to escape the ever-spreading flowers before finding the iconic pipe and entering our first combat encounter. The story seems to heavily revolve around Inako's journey and struggles into womanhood. Game Radar mentioned that the player can read magazines with headlines to the effect of "A woman is only complete when she's loved," as well as radios saying,
"What good is a woman who can't even cook properly?"
What's that? Radio. What's going on with that radio?
Obviously, these themes are very present in Ryushiki 07's work, and they are a perfect fit for Silent Hill. In these games, the protagonist usually fights their own demons, and the fog serves as a projection to the character's most inner fears and desires. Having a game where we play as a schoolgirl figuring out her identity and womanhood can be very intriguing and poignant concept that can inform the player of very real and relatable struggles. It makes the story feel personal to our protagonist, while also having a tangible effect on the player's perception of these topics. Ebisugoka itself is described as a once prominent mining village, only to be left behind with the progression of modern science. The village appears to outright neglect modern medicine in favor of traditional healing methods and Shinto worshipping. This reminds me of the Lost Village from Fatal Frame 2, for example. A place that is trapped in time and is meant to use traditional folklore to make the player feel uneasy. Now the combat is where it gets interesting. In my previous video, I commented that the UI reminded me of a Souls game. At the time, I felt like a complete jackass by saying this, but I guess I was kind of right. The combat has been described as being heavily focused on perfect dodges and counterattacks. What this implies is that the player needs to have perfect timing and learn the enemy's attack patterns to know when to strike. In all honesty, when I last played Silent Hill 2 Remake, I played it on the hardest difficulty, and it felt a little bit like that as well. I absolutely loved that experience with the game, so Silent Hill focusing more on this is honestly kinda my jam. On the other hand, this means that the game focuses very heavily on action, at least compared to the previous entries. The truth is that Silent Hill is very different from Resident Evil. Resident Evil is the perfect mix between action and horror, but Silent Hill is supposed to be psychological horror. the type that gets under your skin. Having an action-heavy Silent Hill game seems to defeat the purpose of the series. At least that's what I would say if I hadn't seen the footage of the game and how it looks as thrilling as it looks demented. I think that for an action-oriented Silent Hill game, the developers need to make the psychological horror aspect that much more effective. And in that regard, Ryukishi07 seems to be the perfect choice to find that balance. As a fan of action games, merging survival horror tension with exhilarating combat feels like a dream come true to me. Of course, I understand this isn't everyone's cup of tea, but I'm merely sharing my thoughts here. Horror and action games, or character action games, are probably my two favorite genres in gaming, along with RPGs. I'm also a huge fan of Japanese horror as a subgenre, so you can understand why I'm so optimistic about this. The previews have also received a lot of pushback because of the animations. When Inako hits an enemy, most of the time they won't react, even though we see a pool of blood coming from the enemy and hear the attack connect. Lack of enemy feedback is something that honestly bothers me in a lot of games. But in here, I feel like there must be a reason for this. Basically, enemies can be staggered, but this only happens when you execute a perfect dodge and follow it with a counterattack. I think the developers are trying to make the counterattacks that much more effective and satisfying by nerfing Inako's regular attacks. In this way, the player will always search for an opening to correctly dodge enemies and counterattack. Other than this, the game also applies a sanity meter, which is something I usually love in games. It makes it feel very Lovecraftian. It also ties the story neatly with the game's mechanics themselves, creating a sense of cohesion I usually crave in these games. Inako's sanity meter lowers when she gets scared or hit, which can start chipping away at her health bar. When it's fully restored, however, Inako and the player have a better understanding of when to dodge, making her much more powerful and efficient in combat. The game also seems to have some light RPG mechanics, like charms you can equip to give you certain boosts, and even buy items in shrines you can pray to, which serve as this game's checkpoint. It actually reminds me of Nioh, an action game also influenced by Japanese mythology. But can it even be considered survival horror, seeing as the game is more focused on combat? Well, the developers have an answer for this in the form of weapon degradation. The mechanic isn't particularly popular, but if you're trying to make a survival horror game work with action mechanics, then I think this is a good way to balance things out. Basically, from previews, I gather that silenthill is giving you a satisfying combat experience, but sometimes running from enemies can still be the best choice. Inako will use melee weapons found in the environment, and the weapons will break after a while. This will not only make them not viable for combat anymore, but they will even change visually, giving the player the indication they are breaking in an immersive way. While there are repair kits in the game, these are pretty scarce. I absolutely love this design choice because running away from enemies has always been a staple of the genre. A lot of the enjoyment in these games comes from player choice. Should I kill this enemy, or should I save bullets for later and run away for now? If silenthill manages to strike a good balance between action and horror in this regard, while also having an effective storyline, then the game has a high chance of being one of the best entries in the franchise. Speaking of which, the game will also not feature any UI during exploration, which is something I absolutely adore. That being said, recently producers Motoya Okamoto and game director Al Yang have been in sort of a small controversy lately. Okamoto recently stated the following: "Inserting more entertaining and thrilling action into silenthill was an idea I had ever since the early phases of the development. And since Neobards is a company that's tremendously good at making action games, this is also one of the reasons why we decided to choose them as the developers." Okay, that makes sense, but then he said, "Challenging action games are gaining popularity among younger players nowadays. So I believe that if we implemented such elements into the game, it would resonate well even with people who are new to the series. And this is where it might worry some fans. Studios trying to achieve success with modern trends is unfortunately nothing new, especially to the survival horror genre. Everyone knows that Resident Evil 6 was a shit show mainly because Capcom wanted that Call of Duty audience. Dead Space 3 also went the same direction and virtually lost all its identity until the remake. So I think it's very fair to get scared by this statement. Yang continued. We didn't want to end up recreating Silent Hill 2 over and over again, and we were aware that there was no reason to keep making clones of it. So in order to avoid repeating what previous major titles did, we decided to make the action stand out more. And in this regard, I think I can understand them better. The truth is that Silent Hill 2 is still widely considered as the best entry in the series. We know what makes a good Silent Hill, but at the same time, that game was made by a very particular group of people. They were misfits and rebels within the company that did a very punk rock kind of game. Without those people, I think that trying to achieve what they did will automatically pale in comparison. So instead of trying to do that, Neobards is trying to do something new altogether. Also, I just noticed the word altogether is 2 words, altogether. One thing I thought is that if Silent Hill F ends up being successful, maybe we can have a sort of side series to the games. Just think about it, we can still get the games with the classic feel in the form of remakes or even sequels, but now and then we can get more action-oriented Silent Hill games with sequels to F. Just like Final Fantasy does sequels to certain games like 10 and 13, Silent Hill can have its own sub-series of games. Obviously, this is pure hypotheticals, but I think Silent Hill F has the ability to not only be a good Silent Hill game, but be different enough from the originals to find its own niche and break out from the genre. Resident Evil has only managed to survive after all these years because Capcom has managed to keep things interesting. What started as survival horror games with fixed camera angles turned into pioneers of the action genre with a shift to an over-the-shoulder perspective. When this eventually stopped working, the games were once again reimagined, this time as first-person horror games. In the case of Silent Hill, while there are some interesting entries like 4 and Shattered Memories that try new things, I feel like most of these games are trying to chase something unattainable. I truly think Team Silent were one of a kind, and nothing can quite compare to them. In that regard, we always have Bloober Team making the remakes, and with the mentorship from original Team Silent members, I think they are more than equipped for the job. When it comes to new entries, however, I find that experimentation is very healthy, just as Capcom proved over the years. Silent Hill F is releasing in over a month, and it has the chance to be something unique. With a different shift in mechanics, it can create a new sub-series of Silent Hill games that we haven't seen before, while also being faithful to what makes Silent Hill so good. The atmosphere, the stories, the awkward characters, and feeling like something is out of place, it seems like it's all here. We even have alternate endings, as the player is rewarded by making subsequent playthroughs. There's still no confirmation on the UFO ending though. If the game manages to balance the new action focus with those classic Silent Hill traits, there's no doubt in my mind that Silent Hill F might be a Game of the Year contender and a great Silent Hill game. We still have to wait a month, so until then, see you next time.